Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey here today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We're really excited about the Winter Bar Conference. The 2023 Winter Bar Conference is January 25 to 27 at the Westin Harborview in Portland. Registration materials have gone out as well as the reservations for the hotel block. So please sign up. This will be our first Winter Bar Conference in person in a couple of years. And so we're excited to see people we haven't seen recently. In addition, I want to announce the new Board of Governors leaders for the Maine State Bar Association starting in 2023. The president will be Stacy Stitham. Our president-elect is Jonathan Dunitz, and the vice president is Susan Fons. So I'm excited to have some new leadership and to hand over the reins. It's been a fun year, but I am ready to move into past president status. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Attorney General Aaron Frey here today. So in past bar talks, when we've had Maine constitutional officers come on, we found that people are interested to hear a little bit about your background. You know, I know you grew up in Dixmont and went to Nokomis. What got you interested in being an attorney? Your experience as a solo attorney in Bangor. And then we'll segue into talking a little bit about your political career.
Well, good morning, and I'm glad to be with everybody. I see a number of familiar names in the group, and looks like maybe a fair number of people from my office. So I'm glad that the OAG can populate the attendance today, get those numbers up. So my name is Aaron Frey. I have the privilege of serving as Maine's Attorney General. I'm just I have really the distinct honor of beginning my third term. And, you know, sort of what led up to this was I did shout out to Dixmont, Maine, right? It's where, you know, my old stomping ground where, you know, went to public school, had to bus to Nokomis, had a lot of fun there. Had a good basketball program, not quite as good as the basketball program they have now, but I like to think that I helped put Nokomis on the map before the basketball took such a big jump with Cooper Flagg. And anyway, went to St. Anselm College down in New Hampshire, really for politics, perfect place for somebody who wants to get a taste of, you know, raw politics, because that was back when it was clear that New Hampshire was a front runner when it came to the primary status. And so all kinds of interesting opportunities coming through there. When I got done, though, I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself. I know I wanted to be a lawyer, but I didn't. I wasn't ready for law school, and I knew that. So I spent a few years down in DC working for one of the, you know, thousands of membership organizations that populate DC. First day down there, it was great. The second day down there, I really wanted to figure out a way to get back to Maine, right? Because Maine is really where I wanted to be, where I grew up. It's where I wanted to just be. And so went to law school in Rhode Island and was able to get a job in Bangor, where I really started what ended up being primarily a solo career, working, representing people in criminal cases, family cases, child protection cases. Most of that was primarily through MCILS, which had just transitioned at that time. So when I started, it was just when MCILS, there's like the Clifford Commission. It had changed from the court being responsible for that program, moved to MCILS, and rewarding work. Really had to help orient people on some of the toughest days that they had as to sort of, you know, what they had to worry about. But really, it was very good work, and it really helped shape some of my views on sort of how people access justice. At the same time, I did have the privilege of representing the people of part of Bangor, part of Orono, and at one point in time, BZ, in the legislature, served for 6 years, 3 terms in the Maine legislature. During that time, I had, don't know what I did to convince people that I was worthy of doing the work, but I was on the Appropriations and Financial Affairs Committee for all 6 of those years. Worked with some really dynamic people. I learned a lot. But in that work, because I was one of the handful of attorneys who were serving in the legislature, because I was on the budget committee, I ended up being one of the primary focal points, along with 1 or 2 others, to deal with criminal justice, judiciary, those different issues that we saw percolating on the really on the legal side. So got to learn a lot about what was going on across the state. Got to work hand in hand with then Attorney General Mills. Got to learn some of the inside dish from Chief Counsel for the governor at that time. And of course, there was some really important conversations that went on at the legislative level that ended up informing how I would go about filling this job as Attorney General. Frank, as I know we talked about, and as I think many folks on this call or on this Zoom probably know, Maine is the only state that elects its Attorney General through a legislative vote. There's only one other state that has a unique process, that's Tennessee, where, Maine should look at this format, by the way, an 8-year term that's elected by the Supreme Court in Tennessee. So that's the only other state. That's 43 other states, DC and a territory in Guam. They elect direct from the voters, their AG. There's 5 states and 3 territories that appoint, where the executive appoints the AG. But Maine, I had to ask. I ended up asking the majority caucus in the legislature, which was the Democratic Party at that time. It has continued to be the Democratic majority since I've been in. I basically asked the legislature to give me the opportunity to serve in this position. And that election actually just happened. It takes place right when the new legislature is sworn in on the first Wednesday of the even-numbered year. And I think that all that work that I just described, right? So, my sort of how I percolated up, how I, had the benefit of working in private practice, concentric circles, by the way, with prosecutors, with AAGs, as a defense attorney. And then, of course, the legislature getting to learn a lot about particularly how the office, how the judicial system, criminal justice system were working. That's really what my background was that I presented to the legislature when they gave me the privilege of serving in this job.
So I have a couple of initial questions I'm going to ask you, Aaron, before we talk about your priorities over the next couple of years. And I also want to let folks know we'll be open to taking questions from the audience. If you, for the Attorney General, if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat and to either Angela or I, and we'll relay the question to the Attorney General. Or if you want to send it to me by email at fbishop@hudco.com, you can also send me a comment or question that way. So when we spoke yesterday, you talked a little bit about the experience of being in the Penobscot Bar and the Bangor Bar. So I was hoping you could just speak to that experience, because I think it's a unique one in Maine. I think it's a little bit different than it is down here in Cumberland County or York County. And also, I'm curious about the exact process that you go through when you become AG. So, for those of us and lay people out in the world, you read in the paper that there's been an election, the Attorney General has been elected by the legislature. But what does that actually look like from the experience of the person who's in it? I know sometimes those constitutional officer elections are contested. I don't believe yours were. But I'm just curious about the inside baseball part of that, of what that looks like.
Let me start with that second part first. So the conversation, it's a more intimate conversation, right? So unlike the other ways in which, leaving Tennessee aside, very clear sort of how somebody directly elected might get elected AG, right? They're out, they're public, they got commercials, they're raising money. And then for those appointed, that's even more inside baseball than I think this, because that's really a relationship that they might have with the governor, the chief executive, and how they get appointed. Here, it is a process that's been in place for a very long time for the AG and the Secretary of State and the state treasurer. The auditor is not technically a constitutional position. You put the auditor in that same category, though, since it is a direct legislative elected position. And so when I was making my case about how my experience and my perspective, warranted a vote for Attorney General, it was really a lot of direct relationships, direct conversations, direct asks, if you will, with the people who are going to be voting for AG, right? So I was, when I first ran, there were 5 total people with their names forward. I was one of those 5, and we were all making our case on a coffee by coffee, driving different candidates to doors to make sure that they could get elected, so that they could then be asked for their vote in the first place. Making sure that there was a presence with those who are going to be serving, so that when it came time for somebody to cast their vote for the 5, I would be at least near the top of their list, right? I mean, I'd love to think that I could have gotten a majority in the first vote, but there were some really excellent candidates, and I'm not going to pretend that I was necessarily the best candidate, because again, the other people running were very talented attorneys as well. That said, there is a long history of service in the legislature that precedes being elected to really any of the constitutional offices, right? And I don't think it's because it's it's not because it's just inside baseball. For me, it really provided an opportunity for people to see how it is that I approached policy issues. They could learn from me what I was doing on a regular basis in court that might help inform decisions that they had to make in the legislature. And of course, there were a number of different initiatives that I worked on the Appropriations Committee as a legislator, where folks just had the opportunity to see very directly what kind of person I was, what my priorities were, and could infer how I might transition into the role of AG and do work that might help them, these legislators, with their job. So I think again, it's really talking with the people who are going to vote. That's members of the legislature, and I don't think this is any secret. I don't think this is any surprise. I did not expect that Republicans were going to vote for me, right? I'm a Democrat. I was a Democratic legislator. I think maybe I got a couple of votes in my second run, but then again, I guess I could have had some Democrats that didn't vote for me. So I don't really know how that would have gone. But really, I was directly focused on making my case to. In my first election, it was 110 Democrats that had out of 186. This past time, for example, there were 104 Democrats, 2 independents that I was making my case to. And that's how it's worked for a very long time. Let me go back to the Penobscot County Bar, because this is an opportunity for me to really highlight, just like I learned a lot and benefited a lot from folks in the legislature who were, whose advice I benefited from and whose guidance was meaningful. As a sole practitioner in Penobscot County, there's different ways I could have gone. I felt very supported by other practitioners in Penobscot County, not just folks who are sort of on the outside that I might ask for some help, but, folks that I was on the other, another attorney who was on the same case, we might've been head to head, but offering constructive, meaningful advice that wasn't meant to benefit their case, but was meant to benefit how I might become a better practitioner to advocate for my clients. So, folks like Marvin Glazier, the late Marvin Glazier, and the late Julie DeSanctis, and Jeff Silverstein, and David Bate, not an exclusive list, but just an example of people that were always willing to be a resource when I had questions about, geez, what's this motion look like? Or, how do I explain this concept to a client? I'm having a hard time landing this concept. Or, I even had judges. In fact, Justice William Anderson just retired from the bench. And I remember him pulling me back into his chambers after a jury trial that I had, in which he explained to me that I needed to do a better job explaining to the jury about the burden of proof on the state, and how that could be very beneficial in giving the jury something to think about and going back to the jury room. That you can't really put that in a book. You really can't teach that in law school. It is an experience that I hope benefited how I was able to be a practitioner. I hope for some of the attorneys that followed me, I was able to provide some of the same type of support because sometimes it's hard and isolating when you're on your own and you're trying to figure out how to do the best you can by your client. And so really, shout out to the Penobscot Bar. I don't know that it's unique to the Penobscot Bar. It certainly wasn't an exclusive list of people who were supportive, but it was something that I think was, a uniquely Maine, if not even a little bit more uniquely Penobscot County Bar situation that I benefited from in my practice years.
That's the way it's always seemed to me when I talk to attorneys from the greater Bangor area, that there's a special kind of collegiality in that area. So let's talk about what it's like to have been the Attorney General. If you don't mind talking about your first term and your priorities for the future, what you envision to be the major issues that you'll be tackling over the next term. And then just what's it like to be the Attorney General on a day-to-day basis? We read about the high-profile cases in the newspaper, but what's it like to actually be AG?
Well, let's start there. It's it's an opportunity to highlight that I benefit so greatly from really talented AAG, Assistant Attorney Generals and Deputy Attorney Generals in the office. The way in which Maine's AG is elected helps insulate your practicing attorneys in the office from politics, right? Like, I didn't bring in a whole host of people when I got, elected to sort of take over how different divisions were run. I have benefited from folks who have dedicated their career to this public service. I don't know what their political affiliation is. The advice that I get is not politically driven. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable in a room when I'm trying to explain that I need to make this work for the chair of appropriations or the chair of judiciary or right, because they're not thinking about the practice of law in the political outcome. They're thinking about, what makes the most sense for, the long-term point of view as to what, because the state, right, we're going to probably be before courts, and we're going to be litigating, some of the same types of cases over and over again. There's a stability that everybody benefits from when you have the state presenting a stable, unified legal position. I benefit from the folks in the office who we pull in great talent. They're public service oriented. They really want to do the right thing by the state and the client agencies. And when I need them to be, when I need to put on sort of the big AG hat and, sort of communicate what might make the most sense for, for advocating for the public good through the law in the state. But so this highlights that the reason that I can day to day do an okay job is largely because there are folks here in the office who are doing such a fantastic job at representing the state. The first couple of terms, in some ways it becomes cyclical, right? Like the legislature is about to come in. One of the unique things I think about the citizen legislature is that when you're first starting out, there is no limit on the number of bills that you can propose. And you don't have to propose only constitutional bills. You don't have to propose bills that are going to pass. You can propose bills that were referred to you by a constituent. So, you look at the last couple of years, last couple of terms, we've seen upwards of 2,000, 2,400 bills over the course of a session. There will be opportunities over the next 6 months to engage with legislators around, their priorities, engage with advocates, engage with the Mills administration, engage with the courts, engage with client agencies on, how to promote, how to protect against, how to educate the legislature on a number of different issues that will either deal with how the law is going to apply in Maine, B, create work for my office, right? In terms of to the extent that there may be some issues that we're hearing some noise might not be constitutional or might be challenged. But I do see part of the job, at least with respect to the legislature being in of this office, as really trying to be a resource to help make sure that whatever does pass not only fulfills the intent of what has been legislated, but my office is responsible in the first instance at defending laws that are passed by the legislature. So then, cyclically, this next 6 months, a lot of bandwidth is going to be focused on that. But in the meantime, there does continue to be really important work that's happening on, attacking the opioid crisis, dealing with some of the challenges that we're experiencing in our environment, dealing with a Supreme Court that, really has a different perspective about what America should look like. And that really gets into priorities. I mean, in fact, those three things in particular are what I hope to be, I guess, gauged on, or what I anticipate will be important benchmarks over the next 2 years. I think folks on this call, folks generally are following just how bad the opioid crisis has engulfed Mainers, right? We see hundreds of Mainers who are succumbing to fatal overdoses this year, and for several years going back for a long time. A even higher number, we started to publicize, or we started seeing information about non-fatal overdoses. It is a crisis that continues to engulf not just the state of Maine, but the nation. I was glad that my office could be directly involved in holding a number of different manufacturers and distributors of opioids accountable, right? So the people who caused this crisis, right, who misrepresented the impact of this drug, caused this crisis. We are seeing significant monies coming into the state because of litigation that my office was directly involved in nationally, and of course, closing it down here, that will be directed out to abatement over the next 2 decades. In particular, the number that we know coming in over the next 18 years is about 130 million that'll go through a Maine Recovery Council. It's going to go through my office, and it's going to go through cities, towns, and counties. I highlight that because over the next 2 years, this Maine Recovery Council, this is a group of 15 different talented people who represent a range of different interests when it comes to the harm that the opioid crisis has caused our communities, right? Those who are directly involved in providing services, those who are responsible for municipal and county budgets, those who are involved in the administration of programming here at the state level, my office, people impacted by addiction. This is a new way in which settlement dollars are being directed. Over the next 2 years, my office is going to be supporting that council, this Maine Recovery Council, with the hope of making sure that it works in directing a fair amount of these resources out to prevention efforts, treatment efforts, recovery efforts, harm reduction efforts. 2 years from now, I expect there'll be some examination of how we did in supporting that work. Meanwhile, we are on the cusp of closing down some other settlements. Stay tuned in the very near future for seeing more information on that, which again, I expect will direct money into the state, flowing directly to abatement efforts. That's a big deal. And I know completely different perspective, by the way, than when I was in the legislature, right? When I was in the legislature, we had a different administration, and we were hearing things like, we don't need Narcan, that just gives them a chance to overdose again, right? Night and day difference in terms of how we are treating substance use disorder in those those individuals and families who are being ravaged by addiction. This is going to be important work over the next 2 years. Second priority is, I think folks on this call have probably been paying attention that this past legislature gave my office permission to use expert outside counsel to bring claims, in particular, against chemical manufacturers, right? So right now, Maine is dealing with a very significant growing issue. We are just still uncovering how bad it is. Issue with PFAS chemicals. Don't ask me what PFAS is the acronym for. I can't say it, but I think we have all heard of PFAS and PFOA chemicals, what they're doing to individuals, what they're doing to farms, what they're doing to water, what they're doing to animals. So the legislature gave my office permission to use outside counsel to hold accountable the manufacturers of these chemicals, getting the resources that we're going to need to get our hands around this crisis. This is the first time that my office will be doing something like this. We'll be using outside counsel like this. The first time since the tobacco litigation back in 1999, 2000. So I expect that the way in which we end up working with outside counsel, developing the case, holding accountable these chemical manufacturers, I expect that my office will be, and me in particular, will be judged on how well we do at trying to hold accountable and advocate for the citizen interest through that specific litigation.
So I'm
And then
curious, I'm curious
go
about
ahead.
the status of that. So how does the selection of outside counsel work? Is that through some sort of RFP-like process?
Yeah, there's nothing specified in the statute, but what we ended up doing is we publicized a request for proposals. We received somewhere between 9 and 11 different fully developed proposals for our consideration. We worked with the client agencies because the client agencies here, like for example, Department of Environmental Protection, they're going to be intimately involved with how the evidence is gathered and presented and developed. So we worked with them to work through the written submissions. We had a series of interviews for those top, for those, knock them out of the park submissions. And so I expect in the near future, what people are going to be hearing from my office is, how it is we've landed on selecting outside counsel and what the next steps are going to be in the litigation process, right? So I'm not talking about just filing claims, right? I mean, this is about organizing, developing, presenting, and negotiating on how we can best, with this expert counsel. My office, by the way, is still going to be involved. It's very important to me that the state and that perspective of what's in the public interest continues to be present in how that litigation is going to develop. And so I have at least 2 AAGs in my office in our natural resources division who are going to be working hand in hand with the outside counsel that we select. In addition, my litigation division chief has been involved in these conversations. My chief deputy is involved in these conversations. I want to make sure we do this right, and I want to make sure that the state's interests are fully represented. And I recognize that expert counsel is needed to do that. So, that process is just from a publicity standpoint. I expect in the very near future, who it is that is landed upon and what that's going to look like moving forward is going to be more available. And just finally, a big priority, not exclusive, by the way, these are not exclusive priorities. This is an including but not limited to. When I was first elected, it was of paramount concern as to what was going on the federal level. There were different activities through the Trump administration that were really being proposed that would run inconsistent with what Maine had already passed as policy. So, for example, there were efforts to undercut the higher emission standards that Maine and 12 other states have had for a long time. California set higher emission standards. Maine joined with that. So this is an example of where the Trump administration was just passing rules to make it easier for people to dump toxins out into the environment. And so, when I started off, it was really about trying to defend Maine and promote rulemaking at the national level to prevent Maine's ability to protect its environment, to protect her citizens. Of course, different administration now, but we are seeing that a much more clearly conservative policymaking perspective is emerging from what we see happening on the federal level, right? So, at the Supreme Court level. So, we had the right of a woman to have an abortion that had been recognized back to Roe 50 years. There are people who grew up never knowing what it meant to not be able to make a decision about whether or not to bear a child. Dobbs took that away, threw it to the states, right? And what's important about Dobbs is not only that we saw the Supreme Court deciding to reverse course, take back a right, sort of redefine what stare decisis actually means, but we also saw some other opinions that suggested that the Supreme Court needs to go further. Last week, we saw, Creative LLC was up in front of the Supreme Court talking about the ability for a Colorado wedding website designer to violate Colorado anti-discrimination laws as to what sort of, clients she would take. By the way, as it came out, it apparently nobody had asked her, but she just wants to make sure that, that there's clarity around the anti-discrimination laws. Maine has anti-discrimination laws, right? We want to make sure that individuals have the ability to be who they are and, have access to services that are open to the public. The Supreme Court could change what that looks like for Maine and our ability for anti-discrimination laws to apply to how you access services that are being made available to the public. Justice Thomas signaled that all these different substantive due process rights, right? So we're talking about contraception. We're talking about what sort of relationships you have, romantic relationships you have, really getting into those privacy interests that I thought had been settled by the court as to what they covered. I am worried about what that might look like. Maine has done a pretty good job at making sure that even if we have now reread the Constitution, we see substantive due process rights stripped from citizens by the Supreme Court, not by Congress, but by the Supreme Court. Then I think Maine's going to have to protect her ability to provide those protections to individuals. What I mean by that is Texas has already made it clear that they're not going to be supportive of Texans going someplace else to access services, abortion services, for example, right? And so not only might they reach into Maine to try to, hold accountable the Texan that might come to Maine to get an abortion, but they might also try to hold the provider in Maine accountable for providing that abortion. That's wild, right? We saw Texas do that with the 2020 election, right? Texas sued Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania about their vote counts. I need to be thinking about over the next 2 years about how, if the Supreme Court continues to move in a direction of, redefining what rights are actually available to citizens under the Constitution, I want to work with the legislature. I want to work with interested parties to protect Maine's ability to, fully recognize rights for all of her citizens. That was a long answer to the question about what the priorities are and sort of what the work has looked like. I'm sure folks have also seen there are some other cases that from time to time pop up that define what the Attorney General's office is up to. The paper does an okay job, or the reporting does an okay job at sort of highlighting how that's working out.
Well, that was a very robust answer and a lot more fulsome than I expected, honestly. Thank you very much for that. I think your priorities are really clear. Aaron has agreed to stay on a little bit longer, take a few questions. I know Angela has at least one. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and we're happy to relay it to the Attorney General.
So I have a question that came through chat. It says, now that there is less overprescription of opiates, are we seeing a reduction in incidents of misuse or deaths? If not, what replaced overprescription as a driver of misuse? And what can be done to prevent addiction in the first instance?
Well, so that last important question, so first, that last part of the question, I don't know that I'm the best person to sort of articulate what's going to, what's going to prevent in the first place. I'm very enthusiastic about the number of professionals out there who are working daily basis, front lines, at helping people get the services that they need when they need them to address where they might be with respect to the use of substances. Right. So when I was practicing, right, when I was a defense attorney, and when I was, when I had clients in my office, and we were sort of talking about some of the struggles that they were experiencing, pills were a little bit more available, right? So we saw folks taking OxyContin and Vicodin, and but when that changed, and we see this in what, my office works with Marcy Sorg at the Margaret Chase Smith Center up at the University of Maine. We on a monthly basis now, we're putting out information about what we're seeing for overdoses, and we work with the administration. We work with the Mills administration, Gordon Smith, on providing a range of information about what we're seeing. And so what we see is when pills became less available, we saw the return of heroin. Fentanyl is finding its way into just about everything. So not just, fentanyl, but fentanyl's finding its way into heroin. We see it being mixed in with, marijuana. We see it being mixed in with methamphetamine. As pills dried up, it moved to heroin, it moved to methamphetamine, it moved to Cocaine continues to be, crack and cocaine continues to be something that we see. Again, fentanyl getting mixed in with all of these things, which is when you look at what's really affecting the overdose, what's the high percentage of overdose causes, fentanyl is like 70 to 75% of what the leading causes. So that's a long way of getting to, just because we were able to address the despicable, disgusting behavior of Purdue Pharma, for example, that got rid of the pills, it got rid of the, had some education about how the pills were going out there, but that didn't stop the addiction, right? I mean, the extent to which there were people who were already addicted, and the extent to which there was some need to replace those pills, we continue to see those other, heroin, with fentanyl mixed in, methamphetamine, crack cocaine. Some pills still sneak in from time to time, but it's just because of maybe access in a parent's, some excess pills that way. So but let me highlight, fentanyl continues to be the top driver of these overdose, fatal overdoses in particular, but also non-fatal overdoses.
Does anybody else have any other questions that they want to pose to the Attorney General? Hearing none, Aaron, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Folks, please do register for the Winter Bar Conference, January 25 to 27. We're really excited about this. We'd like to have a huge turnout. This is my last Bar Talk as president, and so you'll be seeing Stacy at the next one, which is to be determined at a date and guest in February. Everyone have a wonderful holiday season. It's been a pleasure to be the president over the last year.